Nau mai, haere mai, kia ora. My name is Tim, and welcome to our third panel, The Human Cost of Climate Change. For those of you that tuned in yesterday, it's great to see you again. For the newcomers, great to see you, and thanks for joining us. It may be very early morning, late at night, or the middle of the day. It's 4 o'clock here in New Zealand, so we're just getting to the end of our day this Wednesday. I'm based here in Christchurch, and we're joined by our expert panels of Janine, Charles, and Fazila. They are also based here in Christchurch, and they're going to help us discuss this topic of the human cost of climate change. We've got a number of key questions that we're going to be exploring today. These include, where are we at in terms of our understanding of climate change? How will humankind adapt to climate change? What is the role of education to change perceptions? How do we get young people to participate? And we have our final question, what are the actions and opportunities to get involved at an individual and systems level? So these are some of our key discussion points we're going to be going through. For those that were with us yesterday, keep those questions coming through the YouTube channel, and we'll be peppering them into our conversation. We're going to try and land this particular panel under the hour and keep it short and punchy. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Janine to introduce herself and tell us one thing she's most excited about in the climate change space.
Kia ora tātou. Yeah, kia ora tātou. Greetings all. The thing I am most excited about is the opportunity. I don't just see climate change as a big negative. I actually think there's huge opportunity for us to improve health equity while we fight climate change.
Fantastic. Charles?
Kia ora. My name is Charles, and I think one of the most important things for me is youth engagement, youth participation, and how youth value the information that they get as regards climate change. I do understand that there are issues in terms of how climate change is accepted among young people. So I'm very much interested in how young people accept and assimilate and also analyze the information they get, and importantly, participate in climate change actions.
Where are you from, Charles?
I am from Nigeria, sorry.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fazila, lucky last.
Hi, I'm Fazila. I'm from Maldives. I'm interested in how educational research can, how climate change research can make a difference.
A difference around, have you got a specific thing that you're looking to make a difference in?
Yeah, in attitude, knowledge, and perception regarding climate change.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, let's begin with this question of how will humankind adapt to climate change? This is a big question. Who wants to start with trying to break this down for our participants?
I'll give it a go.
Good one.
So,
Janine.
for me, adapting to climate change, I think the best way to break it down is to think that all the actions we can take for climate change are actions that are just in general really good for human beings and the planet. So even if you had no interest in climate change, I'm sure you want to have clean water to drink, and you want to have good air to breathe, and you want to live in a world where you can sort of see good things happening. You're not constantly concerned about increasing climate change. So for me, it's taking on what you can and going for it. I've chosen health and looking at ways we can adapt to lessen the impacts of that.
So what you're saying is that there are multiple ways of looking at climate change as a problem, but to use your words,
Yes.
as an opportunity, and you're saying that the health pathway for you is what resonates. And I know we'll get into this, is just uncovering, potentially you can just elaborate on, are there some specific things that you're interested in from a health perspective that relates to climate change?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, straight off the bat, I'm going to be really honest. I've grown up in the typical New Zealand Kiwi fashion with meat, in a lot of meals, and seen as pretty core to it. I've made the decision to not have meat in my household, so that meat will become a social treat. If you're out, there's meat and you have it. So I'm not vegetarian, but I'm not going to add to the consumption of meat. The other wonderful thing is that if we eat less meat and eat more plant-based foods, we're also contributing to climate change adaptation, because we're going to be putting more carbon, sequestering more carbon for the growing of the plants.
So a really simple thing, and we saw this yesterday in our social change panel discussion, where we really sort of locked in on this idea of that these big wicked problems seem somewhat insurmountable, but by starting in a very simple way, like you describe, of choosing not to eat meat, actually you're addressing this question of adaptation to climate change. You're doing your part.
Yeah.
Charles,
and it's also
Sheila?
Healthy.
Yeah, that helps too. Charles, Sheila, how do you think about this question?
Well, I think, like what Janine has said, each of us, we all have that responsibility of reducing our carbon footprint. And sometimes the problem is, some of the issues around taking action is, how do I, as an individual, in this world of discussions around climate change, which sometimes you did mention earlier, can be very philosophical, but how do I, as an individual, in the smallest terms, take an action that can really mean me adapting to these changes in the climate? And what Janine has just said is a clear example, taking that very simple but direct step. And we can talk about it from an individual basis like Janine, but we can also talk about it from a system level. Like we, again, for example, if you come to New Zealand, one of the issues you always be confronted with is the farming practices, and how in terms of say cattle rearing and all that, and the kind of feeding and how much methane, for example, it produces that goes into the land and into the water stream. And so that decision from Janine would impact on her own level, but even farmers taking that decision in terms of what kind of feeding practice, what kind of rearing practice that we go, can also impact in a very wilder space. And then,
so Charles, what I'm picking up is that there is an individual aspect which Janine has highlighted, but also climate change at a systemic level. And how do we think about it? Because I think from a problem-solving perspective, it's the system level that a lot of us, and potentially you participants, want to dive into over the course of the summit, is what system level changes can we make to answer this question? And Fazila, perhaps you want to add something around system level thinking to solve this question.
From a current report by UNESCO, we have seen that only 40% of the schools, they actually address issues related to climate change. So why don't we start from the school level, that there's a need that we need, there's a thing that we need to change. So these changes starts with children. So children should know that climate change is actually a problem, and then it starts with the individual level. So there's obviously it can be tackled at the system level, but every individual has a responsibility for where we live, the environment. So to love our environment, it should start with children.
Fantastic. So what you're saying there is actually you're starting to identify a solution in that education to our children, because climate change is a generational challenge, and not just for us, but our children and our grandchildren are going to face the consequences or the challenge of adapting to climate change, and education is a starting point.
Yes, education on the importance of nutrition. In terms of nutrition, what we need to take, what is required by our body. Not only like it's the culture that we eat meat, but it's the nutrition that we need to intake. So the what nutritions we need, rather than what are like cultural food that we intake. So like we need to have a balance between the two, the cultural food and the nutrition that we need, the nutrition that our body needs.
One of the discussion points from our space conversation yesterday was around space is a great environment that forces us to be more efficient in the way that we think about sustaining life. And one of the learnings from exploring space in relation to your conversation point, and that what do we fundamentally need to survive? And by learning how to do that in space, being more efficient in the way that we live, we can translate that back down onto Earth. And what you're saying is that can have a very positive impact on our environment and ultimately our climate. Because if we're taking less, we're going to have less of an impact.
Yeah.
So apart from nutrition and health, are there other aspects of climate change and climate change adaptation that you are thinking about?
I think there's the mental health aspect's really important, because it can seem very doom and gloom and get people pretty depressed. So people have to be, I guess, prepared to grieve at a certain point over what we're facing, but to take that unhappiness or that fear and turn it into action, because that's the only way they're going to empower themselves to feel like they can make a difference. I'm a big fan of doing the old carbon footprint test online somewhere and then seeing how you can improve it.
Cecilia, I just think about this in relation to the Maldives, which is one of the nations that is perhaps the most susceptible to climate change impact. Is there an awareness from a mental health perspective of this coming disaster?
We actually realized the importance of mental health awareness after tsunami of 2005.
Okay.
So when like 84 people died from tsunami, but still, like, people does not talk about it. People does not talk about land erosion. So like one of the most difficult situations that the islands face is during southwest winds. The currents are really high, and then due to the high currents, we get sea erosion, like land erosion, a lot. So like, but still, like, people think that growing mangroves is like the beaches won't look nice because it's like white sandy beaches, and then you go for you can stay, like, if the mangroves are there, you can't sit on like on the beaches nicely. So like it's I think
there's a challenge, right?
Yes.
There's a challenge for people to get their head around. I guess the trade-offs of adaptation. What we're getting the question here around. We've got one which is related to this. Does climate change affect the social status level in the world? So that the equity of our living situation. Charles, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We can talk about it from the international level, and for example, the impact of globalization and how it causes or leads to international inequalities. And of course, climate change is in that same realm. It is a fact. We have data to show that only around, probably maybe I say about 10 countries, for example, add a large number, more than 60 to 70% of the sources of global warming, for example, and things that cause climate change. But it is the poorer nations who add less than 2% to this issue that suffer it the most. So from that international level, we have that discrepancy, we have that inequality in terms of
it's a really important point, and I think I feel like with this discussion we could go down any one of these pathways, the inequity of climate change. But I guess where I'd like to take the conversation is to our next key discussion point is, where are we at in terms of our understanding of climate change? And one of the questions we're getting from our audience is, what are the parameters that we need to consider to know whether an activity is contributing to climate change or isn't it? You know, how do we start to understand the phenomenon? Because the science is complex, right?
Yeah, the science is complex, but there are multiple resources out there that have been developed from governments to NGOs to try and break it down, to keep it quite simple. For starters, just reading one or two good books or understanding the carbon cycle isn't that difficult. I can give a quick example. So if you've got a situation where it's hot and you have trees in your city, but it's because of climate change, it's getting hotter and hotter. At a certain point, those trees' stomas close down, so they stop doing the job they do to help protect us with the carbon dioxide, because they don't want to lose their water. So they'll stop working, which makes, of course, the air pollution even worse. So that's where we realise that it gets to a certain point where you've got to keep those cities cooler, or even the current mitigations aren't going to work.
Janine, I saw something a couple of months back around cities starting to paint roofs white. Have you seen this?
No, that's fascinating.
Reflect heat away from... And what is interesting for you participants, particularly in the big cities that have a lot of dark concrete, that sometimes the difference in temperature between the urban environment and just the natural environment outside of the city can be as much as 5 degrees difference on average. And that's significant, right? And potentially someone would want to talk about that, is so often people go, you know, what's 1.5 degrees climate change? You know, what's 1.5 degrees increase? It doesn't really matter, right? Like, it was 10 degrees yesterday, now it's 25 degrees. Everything's all right. That's 15 degrees. Can someone talk about how 1.5 degrees is actually really significant? Who wants to jump in?
Well, I think I might just go into the report by IPCC and how they try to show how important it is for that 0.5 change in terms of our initial target of 2 degrees, and now being more ambitious and taking it to 1.5. And some of the issues that they have raised is that if we think of 1.5, then we are able to save for example, the coral reefs, which would have, with 2 degree rise, would have been lost by between 2030 to 2050. I mean, totally lost. But with 1.5, then we're able to save up to 20 to 30% of that. That is huge. And we are talking about coral reefs, and we've seen some of the pictures in terms of how dark and how troubling it can be. And we can also look at other issues around in terms of adaptation, how we are able to adapt, and how 1.5 and 2 degrees can really be very wild. So it's not just the literal number, but it's that overall additions, you know, that can influence a lot of changes globally.
So where are we at in our terms of understanding? Are we at a point where adaptation is essentially, it's something we have to do? We have to accept climate change is happening, and the consequence of that is sea level rise and more turbulent weather. Or are there things that we can fundamentally do to stop what is already underway?
First, I'd like to take this question and linking it with understanding with one particular issue of value. I think in terms of coming back to that issue of before taking actions and before thinking of adapting, this issue of understanding is very, very key.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take it in terms of value. Now, the information that you get, research has shown that the information that you get and how you analyze information is centered around your value system and how you believe and what your belief is. Now, the value that people place on climate change will always influence how they analyze information. And I think that particular value system is impacting on our understanding of climate change today. And so it also calls for action in terms of that educational impact on changing the value system of people and how they understand and how they view climate change, because that would very much affect how they analyze the information that they get as regards climate change. For example, okay.
Sorry, Charles. I've got a question coming in from the audience around, and this is relating to feeling the impact of climate change. Is what is going to be one of the effects on our health of climate change, and what's the most, I guess, urgent one that we need to be aware of? What do we need to be most concerned? And Janine, maybe you want to answer this.
Okay, I think the heat is going to be one of those areas that's really going to hit people, and as always, it's the most vulnerable that get hit the worst. So it'll be our elderly, newborns, probably Indigenous peoples, people in lower socioeconomic situations. So this becomes part of insulating our houses better, all these different things we can do to improve the general health of populations. A lot of what climate change will do to health is I think the best thing we could be doing as a globe is improving health equity. Because if we improve health equity, the big impact of climate change on health will be lessened, because there will be less people that are going to be hit really hard by it. There's a whole range of things that are going to be affected, because as the climate changes, you have things like vector-borne diseases, so mosquitoes moving to areas they weren't in previously. You have Lyme's disease, people being vulnerable to that and they haven't been. So it's getting ahead of it.
One of the things in terms of practical steps or solutions for our participants to be thinking about is, you mentioned just insulation to homes.
Yeah.
I suppose looking at ways to help humans cope with more extreme conditions.
Yes.
And again, what I love about the summit is the relationships here between the panels. And I think back to our space conversation yesterday, is space is an incredibly extreme environment that forces us to learn how to adapt there. And the learning from there can potentially be pulled back to Earth to help us deal with this massive issue of adapting to climate change, and vice versa, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So from a heat perspective and limiting the impact on health, can any of you talk about some of the things potentially participants might want to consider as solutions to explore?
Oh, well, I don't know if we're ready to start talking about solutions, because I'm really clear towards that. Because we have a slide where we want to talk about solutions in terms of opportunities and actions, both from an individual and system level. But I don't want to jump into that for now. But we must understand something when it comes to our lives, our daily living. Some of the technologies that we use today in terms of cooking, in terms of transportation, in terms of eating, are over a century old. And because they are over a century old, they don't really relate to our current needs and our current realities. And so what it means is that, and so the truth is that today in New Zealand, there is that issue, and I think other places of the world, that issue of the continuous rise of heating, the continuous rise of electricity in terms of cost, and also petrol, of course, is one huge part. And that is because the technologies that we are using for some of these issues are too old. They're over a century old. And so it means that for us to take actions and bring our resources into the current future, then what we'll be saying is that we're going to save more money to our pocket. So that is direct impact to the people, to individuals. So Janine did talk about having better insulation system, double glazing, for example. And then what happens is that our homes are heated better, so we spend less in heating. We can also look at using more friendly electric power system and all that. So yeah, there can be that individual gains that we can get, which is now, because I do understand that one of the problem that people have with taking actions on climate change is that they feel it's altruistic. That if I take what I'm doing today for climate change is only for the future generation and not for me today.
There's actually something you can benefit from now.
Yeah. So that's the thing.
So, Charles, what I'm picking up from what you're saying is actually by looking at ways to accelerate the adoption of technology that help us live in the modern world. Because as what Charles is saying, and participants, you may not have picked this up, but Charles is saying is that actually we're living in 2018 the same way we were living maybe 100 years ago.
That's it.
And there is a cost of that. We know better. We can live more efficiently. So potentially one thing you can look at is how in your local communities can you accelerate the adoption of smarter, more efficient technologies.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, that's quite a lovely catch-all for people to start thinking about. Is that it's a very practical thing to do, right?
Yeah. Ride the bike, take the public transport. You know, I guess it's just making those choices on a daily basis, and being aware makes a huge difference.
So one of the questions that has come through is, you know, people are saying that the zero carbon bill and the price on carbon will fundamentally not achieve the change. And it's how do we create a groundswell of change? And this perhaps takes us on to our next question. And we've touched on education before, but what is the role in education? You were talking, Cecilia, about education at a grassroots level of the importance of climate change and some of the practical things that can be done to stop it or curb it, and also adapt to it. So do you want to pick up that question around what is the role of education to change our perceptions around climate change?
Education actually plays a key role for changing perception. So education is not only a pathway for employment, it is the pathway for awareness, it is the pathway for knowledge, it is also a pathway for research on climate change. So we see that we spent a very little amount of money, less than 10% on climate change research. Why is that? Is it because we think that we are not affected by climate change today, or we think that it's going to be after so many years? But it has been predicted that by 2050 there will be 80 million people vulnerable to climate change, and most of them are children and women.
Interesting. So again, education is a tool to facilitate understanding, but also solving these solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can comment, I did mention about value system, how that impacts on how we analyze information. And of course, there is no greater tool that can, reshape or reshape our value system aside from education. So it is a very, very key tool. Like I was discussing with Janine and Fazila the other time, and we were like, can we really take account of, for example, using New Zealand, for example, and take account of scholarship available for students in New Zealand that are specific to climate change research? We probably might not be able to count up to 10. So we are not doing enough in terms of recognizing the impact and importance of education in driving perception and knowledge, like facilitated.
Well, I guess this is the power of the summit, and this goes beyond climate change, but we know the role of education helps change human behavior. It unlocks possibility, it unlocks, where it creates awareness and desire for change. And what we're saying is that actually one place for you to look, not only we've talked about accelerating the adoption of technology, but you can look to how do you raise greater awareness and educate people around what is climate change, how is it going to impact you on a local level, and then what are the things you can do about it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's key that the name of this symposium is Emerging Futures. If you want to be employed in the future, I can tell you right now, climate change is going to be an area that is unfortunately going to be a growth industry in terms of what's going to need to happen. So I hope that the educators of today are realising that we need problem solvers, creative thinkers, people who think outside the box, and who are willing to be leaders on this.
It's interesting, Janine. Again, we're seeing this theme emerge throughout the summit so far, that this idea of thinking outside of the box, the need to have cross-functional thinking, so diverse thinking around these problems, is that we just don't need climate change scientists or mathematicians. No. We need artists, we need philosophers, we need
social entrepreneurs.
There you go. You know, we need the complete mix, and the term that came back yesterday was we need everybody.
I actually want to add one thing to it. While I was, since I'm doing my PhD on specific conditions like COPD, asthma, hypertension, chronic kidney diseases, specifically mostly on chronic conditions. So one of the risk factors for the chronic conditions is climate change. So it's something that we need to think about how we can change our economic focus to a more green focus that can actually help us to economize our health system. So we spend so much on health insurance, we spend so much on our healthcare, but still we do not know that the climate change actually affects our health. So which we need to take into consideration now.
So one of the flavors that is coming out in the discussion that's happening online is people are starting to ask questions of, what is the one thing that governments could do now to change the course of the climate change story? There's another flavor coming here around, is it too late? Are we taking action too late? Should we focus on the biggest polluter? And these are all, they all strike me as observations that are well beyond the individual level. They're at a systemic level.
Yeah.
And this is where, at least for me personally, and I'm sure you feel the same, is that it's very disempowering to think about these big things that are difficult to change. How do you, as individuals that are active in this space, reconcile the big systemic things that you'd love to be able to fix versus taking really concrete individual action?
I'd just like to say quickly that a couple of years ago, I don't think anyone would have believed that plastic bags would more or less get banned in New Zealand and not be available in supermarkets. I doubt plenty of directors in Hollywood would have envisaged the Me Too movement either. So I think human beings as a collective, especially through social media, have an awful lot of power. We have to believe in ourselves and we need to actually take action. So it's just a matter of, that's what the internet's there for, people. It's there to network us and to get us to join our energy together and to just drive it home to politicians what you expect of them. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Charles?
I flowing from what Janine has said, I don't think that 10 years ago that we would have believed that someday a female prime minister from one island nation called New Zealand will go to the United Nations General Assembly with her baby, saying hi to everyone. So there are changes and things are happening. We're going to experience more changes. And I think, for example, going down to the IPC and CC reports, it has called us to remember that we can be more ambitious, and being more ambitious is going from the 2 degree target to 1.5 degrees. So things are going to happen. But coming to the question of, with what we have on the slide, how do we get young people to participate? I would like to, throw in some couple of points. Number one, there needs to be a kind of more meaningful engagement in local adaptation. That is, young people need to get involved in decision-making issues that actually affect them as young people. And it's important that we also involve young people to participate in policy dialogue, both within government and private sector, non-governmental organizations level. We need to also get coordinated campaigning and on issues about actions around climate change. And of course, that educational skill, it is very, very key. How do we get young people to improve and develop their skill? In fact, we need to change our curriculum system in terms of climate change and education, because like we have all agreed here, that value system are definitely changed by education. And there's no better way to develop skills, expertise, and interest in climate change than through education. There needs to be a more sterile level of access to information for young people and access to research funding. And so young people can start seeing these opportunities within this frame and get more engaged and participate better.
So, Charles, for young people, is it possible to give them concrete action? Because there's nothing more compelling than taking action, seeing the benefit of taking that action. And, I feel like that's such an important part of us building momentum, is getting people to feel like it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It is an initial step that, even though we failed to take from the start, it's never too late. And I think it has the new drive and the new reports, the ambitious move by IPCC in stating some of the things that they've stated, is a call to action for us to, engage more young people, and for young people to understand that there are opportunities that we can explore. But of course, we need that level of engagement. We need that exposure, that coordination, from private sector, from the government, because I believe that we can't leave it to the government alone. No. Because if we do, then that idea of denialism, which most of the global actors who are mostly in the government sectors will continue to weigh us down in terms of our actions. So the private sector needs to rally around young people.
That takes us to our final discussion point around, what are the actions and opportunities to get involved in an individual and systems level. And I think we've just over 20 minutes left in our conversation. This is where I think I encourage you participants to really get your questions into the YouTube channel. I'm going to throw this to you, Janine, to potentially just talk about it from your perspective. What are those actions and opportunities to get involved?
Okay, well, I'm a good example, a 52-year-old who just decided she would throw herself into this. I'm not a climate scientist. My background's been fairly global, so I've sort of had a lucky opportunity to see different things happening around the world. But I just decided that leadership begins with me. I can't rely on other people to do the things I want them to do. I need to do them. So that goes for every single one of you out there. If you want to see change, you have to be the change. And you'll be amazed. Like, I've just kept going, and doors have opened, and people have said, yes, we want to work with you. We're at the stage now where we're having wonderful dialogue with the University of Canterbury, and what we're trying to do is start a global centre of climate change, health, and disaster resilience.
Cool. Fantastic.
So yeah, you can actually just, it doesn't have to be something that already exists. Just start.
One of the things that came from yesterday was that the panels were encouraging people to start with their passion.
Yeah.
Find the thing that you're passionate about, and chances are that passion comes from observing a problem, which on the other side of a problem is an opportunity. But the key thing is finding the passion. And it sounds to me, Janine, that you've just followed your passion.
Yeah, basically.
Charles and Zila, does that resonate with you?
Yes, I think I started when I started my career. I was only a psychologist, and when we had tsunami in 2005 in Maldives, we realized that a lot of people have been mentally affected. Still, they do not want it. It is one of the reasons I think that people didn't want to talk about it. They were scared. They didn't know what to do about it. So yeah, they were scared. They didn't know what they want, what they need, and what they wanted to do. So that's why I actually started to work with the current university in Maldives. We just have only two universities there. So we started to work with the main university regarding climate change. But still, it was difficult to convince the student that we need to talk about climate change. It's like I think I mentioned that regarding the mangroves, students said that why do we need to grow mangroves? Is it necessary?
Totally.
Yes.
One of the things that's come up from our group is, shouldn't we be rioting in the streets? Is that a way to take action? And someone's saying, the governments have perpetrated this terrible thing over the last 20 years. Is one way to take action to just get angry? Is that something that we should be considering?
I'm a bit of a fan of the idea of the resistance, actually. I think there's some wonderful things you can do via passive resistance and even active resistance to what's going on. I don't know that anger is useful. It's like that anger has to become action. So you can teach people an awful lot by doing. Yeah.
So go and riot in the streets around promoting this great opportunity to do something constructive. Go and shout that from a march down the streets around how you're planting 1 million trees in your city, but don't go and get angry and not channel that somewhere.
No, anger shuts people down. The people do not listen to angry people. I think that's something the left has had to learn. There's no point in being the strident, angry person. Find out what that person values. If, for example, if their love is rugby, then you point out to them that their region has drought now, and it didn't used to. And the rugby grounds are going to get closed down if action isn't taken, because then it's going to be too expensive or too difficult to irrigate them.
So again, we keep hearing this flavor of education and raising awareness. Potentially, I'd like it to just switch the focus around what are some concrete things that we've talked about: accelerating the adoption of technology. We've talked about looking at potentially vaccines to protect against diseases that were not currently present. What are some other things that our participants can start to turn their minds to around how do we solve this, either solve climate change, so stop it progressing, or adapt to it?
Yeah, of course, I think what we have highlighted in the slide there is that there is both that individual and system level of opportunities and also taking actions. And talking about what participants can do specifically, Janine did mention about her own move of cutting down meat intake and trying to reduce our own carbon footprint. I think the first thing is for us to ask ourselves first, what is my carbon footprint? We need to locate ourselves within that web. So there are resources out there on the internet that can show you how to calculate your carbon footprint and how to reduce it, particles that you can reduce it. So I think it is important that we find those resources and also find out how we can actually know, me as an individual, what is my carbon footprint on the earth. So it becomes an individual issue, what you are adding to the earth. To the environment. So we need to look at some of our decisions in terms of using carrier bags. Are we recycling our bags? Are we taking actions of making sure we distribute? We make sure we recycle. Another thing is in terms of our behavioral our lifestyle. Thinking of what amount of transportation the impact on the environment we use, and that is still about carbon footprint. Do we become more active in terms of using bicycles, rather than always using cars? That is direct impact to reducing your carbon footprint. It can be in terms of, well, that's individual, but we can also go system level. We can think of
one observation, Charles, and this is potentially close to your home in Nigeria. I'm aware in Africa that the small bus system, like around car sharing, and sharing. So creating a car sharing or creating a bicycle sharing network is actually a way of facilitating an individual change at a systemic level, right?
Absolutely, it is. It is very, very effective, and you kind of see people going away now from the big cars and all that, and going to small, and we call that keke napep back home. So they are very effective because they give out lesser amounts of carbon to the environment. But you did mention about that systemic level, and taking Nigeria for example. Now, taking direct actions, we've had for a long time now, there's farmers and herders clash in Nigeria, which has killed thousands of people in the past decade, more than 10,000 people killed by herders who moved from the northern region, which is more dry and suffering drought, to the north central and the southern part. And so what they do is that they invade farms and then kill both women, children, and men, the farmers, and then so that their cattle can feed from the crops. Now, this is an ongoing issue. Now, from a systemic level, where the government think better and develop more climate-friendly way of taking care of the herders, like ranching and all that, what it does is that it also introduces climate security, and ensures that people are secured even in their own farmlands and all that, and reduces the number of deaths that we have recorded from this crisis that is climate linked, but people don't really take it that it's actually climate change linked. So apart from that, we can also think about more efficient public infrastructure, public health infrastructure, a very more efficient one. We can also think about bringing in AI in terms of artificial intelligence in terms of healthcare delivery, and so it reduces the aspect of also movement and reduces the congestion in service delivery in healthcare.
One thing I'd like to test with you is that I now the food that I consume during the week comes from a very local shared kitchen, and so this local chef orders only the food that I need to prepare this meal, and the waste coming out of my kitchen has gone from maybe 30% down to less than 5%. And again, this seems to me, I hadn't thought about it until this time, but this very simple step around sharing the efficiency around our food and sharing food means that actually my impact on the climate is reduced. And for you participants, I think what I'm learning from this conversation is that actually, if behind every problem, there is a link to the climate, our impact on the climate. And by simply looking for efficiency and looking for ways to make the way that we do our daily activity less impactful on the planet, you don't really need to look too far to find a problem to work on. That's what I've picked up.
Yeah.
Oh, Charles?
Yeah, you did mention about roofs being painted white in some realms now, so as to reflect heat. But we can also go further. We can be more ambitious and start thinking of having roofs that are made of covered with plants, that are covered with vegetation, because it's not just about reflectance, but it's also about trapping the CO2 levels from the atmosphere, and also giving us a fresher environment.
That's great. I'm just going to have a quick look here if we've got any further questions. Participants, we've got 10 minutes to go. This is the time to really get the questions into the channel. Let me have a look here. We've got one question here around, as consumers, we also need to stop buying. Like the consumption, the way that we consume is really, and again, I think the theme here is the efficiency with how we live. Our consumer-orientated lifestyle is not so conducive to looking after our planet. Is that right?
The fashion industry is a fascinating area, actually. For anyone out there who's interested in fashion, research what goes on there. I mean, more from choice rather than the realization. I've bought my clothes from op shops for years. And it's great because, you've kind of, it's feel good. You get a really good bargain, but also it takes a lot of energy to create clothing and things like that. And it's just one of those, all those simple things, the daily sort of way of doing things that can make a difference.
Another question here is, should the world be prioritizing a switch to electric versus fossil fuels as our energy source?
Oh, I'm very interested in that question because for me, I've always discussed with my students when discussing issues around climate change. I've been alarmed at how much cars we have, for example, in Christchurch. And I've always said that I think there are more cars in Christchurch than there are humans in Christchurch. Yeah, it's a very small city, yet we have so many cars, and it's very disappointing. It means that our transport system needs to be upgraded. I think there are moves. The other day, there were information about coming to engage in the public debate discussion session about how to reinvent Christchurch transportation system. So, of course, in fact, I was discussing with Fazila the other day that I really want to go electric. I want to throw away my car and go electric. But the cost of the electric cars are so much, they're so high that you kind of think, is there a direct policy from the global players to ensure that people don't get access to electric cars and just continue to dwell in, because the other cars are getting cheaper, but electric cars are getting more expensive. And even electricity, we have a massive, for example, in Africa and in Nigeria, we have almost 365 days of sunlight. And then you continue to wonder, if we have 365 days of sunlight in Nigeria, why do we have why is electric solar power one of the most expensive power in the country? People cannot access it. So is there a direct action taken to ensure that this happens and continue to increase and develop the petroleum sector? So it is an issue, and we need to start discussing about it. We need to find ways to reduce the cost of electric cars, which we should, start changing to.
Well, a question that's come up is that one of the consequences of going more electric, and these are kind of the externalities of making changes. Someone's saying by going electric doesn't mean we need to do more mining for lithium and other toxins, and what's the consequence of that? Do we need to be mindful of the downstream impacts of these changes that we think are good but actually might be bad?
Yeah, definitely. It's an area where I guess again, with the reading you can do, you can sort of see that there are different stages of doing things, and some actions might not be great actions, but they can be stepping stones to the development of better technology that's going to be less invasive and finding other ways of doing it. I mean, public transport is still, that mass getting people around seems to be the way to do it, really. And I guess working closer to where you live, all these things become, choices to make.
So we've got 5 minutes to go, and the audience is interested in, what are you individually, if you were doing this summit, you had 10 days to work with a diverse group of people from around the world, what would you be working on? And perhaps, I don't mind who answers that question first, but if you had 10 days to really dive into the climate change problem and you could work with a group of people, what would you be doing?
I'd be working on communication. I'd be going, how do we empower people? How do we take the fear out of this, but keep the action and the energy and the drive to do it? So I would be definitely thinking, how do we get to have this conversation without people thinking it's too big, it's too scary?
Yeah.
I would be thinking about how to make healthy choices by research.
Through research, so data-driven
Yes.
decision making.
Yes.
And does that go beyond just health, Fazila? Does it go to, how can we use data to make better choices around our mode of transport?
Yes. Now, for example, a public transport can be an option. Also, healthy choices such as bicycling, walking, that can also reduce our chances of getting a stroke. Little things can make a difference.
Yeah, I like that. Charles.
Oh, I'll develop a 48-hour challenge, a 48-hour idea challenge. It's incredible when you bring young people together, the kind of ideas that can be developed. And I thought if you put young people together from every part of the world to develop new ideas and new solutions to developing technologies and products that would help to ease some of our issues, you'd be amazed at the kind of ideas that can come out from such moves. So, like you said, communication, education, empowering people, getting them involved, put people together, and in 48 hours we can bring out lasting solutions. But of course, we need to be very practical. So for me, I will be thinking of how do I ensure that we can make electric cars that will be less than $2,000 for young people to be able to afford. That will be less than $5,000 instead of the 20,000, 18,000. Because transportation is huge in terms of how much it releases carbon flows and other gases.
Reduce the barriers to making good choices. Yeah. Look, we're going to leave it there. I think we could go on. We could probably spend another hour, but I'm mindful of time. I feel like we've got great momentum around this. Participants, on behalf of the summit, I think we'd love to say thank you to Charles, Fazila, and Janine for joining us. We have another panel kicking off in an hour's time. Be here. You don't want to miss it. And thank you from Christchurch. We'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.